at the lair. Leo and Raph had gone their separate ways to blow off steam from their argument from patrol. Leo sat on the couch watching Space Heroes, and Raph went off to train. Their other brother and little sister went off to meditate with Master Splinter for the remaining time. Danny was in his lab as usual, and Mikey was in the kitchen, looking in the drawers for something. As he did so, he would look over to the table at his new pony that sat there. His heart stung at the sight of his new doll looking like an injured, dirty mess. The rocks poking out of the body with a few glass pieces sticking through the mane and tail. Oh, those cerulean eyes that almost looked right at him were filled with nothing. But to Mikey, those eyes were filled with sadness, pain. Finally, his baby blue eyes had settled onto a pair of tweezers in one of the drawers. They were slightly chipped, but they seemed good enough to use. I knew I could find some, Mikey thought, hinted to himself. He grabbed the tweezers and walked over to the pony, but before he could reach for her, he suddenly stopped in his tracks. He looked at her with worry and confusion. He didn't say a word. He felt worried when his gaze was transfixed on her. He couldn't see it, but he could imagine the doll, shaking in pain and fear. Mikey didn't know why, but he didn't want to scare her. Gently, he set the tweezers aside and petted the broken mane of his new pony. "It's okay. I'm just going to take those nasty rocks and glass out of you." He said those words as comfortingly as he could, as if the pony was a small child too scared to get a shot. "I know you're scared, but I promise I'll be gentle. Please, let me get those rocks and glass pieces out." Mikey completely went silent. He stood there, patiently waiting for permission from the pony doll. About a minute later, he smiled and took out a small plate from one of the cabinets and set aside. His hand reached and gently grasped the pony's right foreleg with his 2 fingers, with the tweezers in his other hand. He squinted his eyes towards one of the cuts on her foreleg. Tiny rocks, pebbles, and 2 slightly seamed splints of wood were poking out of the surprisingly still clean white cotton. He lowered the tweezers carefully down, and then towards his first splint. With careful grabbing, he gently pulled it out of the pony's foreleg and placed it on the plate. He went towards the second splint of wood, this one being a bit difficult to pull out because it was tangled with some of the cotton. Mikey could imagine the doll whimpering in pain and holding back tears. He thought his heart hurt from this image in his head, so he did his best to pull out the wood splint without hurting the doll any further. About a minute later, he finally got it out of his pony's foreleg. He stopped himself from going further, pulling more out as he could imagine his pony crying from the intense pain. About a minute or two, he imagined her calming down and nodding for him to continue. He nodded back and began to start again. Piece by piece, Mikey picked out each rock, pebble, wood splints, and glass piece out of his pony. He placed every one of them on the plate so he could throw them out when he was done. And he managed to remove the very last piece of glass out of the pony's chest. He dropped the piece on the plate and smiled comfortingly with his fat expression. He set the tweezers aside and picked her up with his arms. Holding her into a gentle hug, he still kept his smile. Though he could have sworn he heard sniffling come to a stop. He picked her up, like a small child, and held her close to him. He saw the blue, cerulean eyes on the doll, and he could have seen them twinkle a bit. He smiled softly and kissed her forehead. He reached down to grab the plate, and then threw away the rocks, pebbles, white splints, and shards of tiny glass into the trash can, being careful to make sure not one fell out or a shard of glass broke through the bag. Once he made sure they were all in the garbage bag, he adjusted his arms to keep his pony doll up, and he walked out of the kitchen. Once in the living room, Mikey saw April enter the lair with a small plastic bag in tow. She said her hellos to Leo and Raph, Ollie and Kung-Fu when her gaze switched to Mikey's direction. She smiled and walked over to him. The orange-masked turtle could now see what was inside of the plastic bag. He could see colorful spools of thread and what seemed to be a small red paper with 4 needles stuck through it to hold them in place. His baby blue eyes met April's sapphire blue ones, and she had a warm smile on her face. "Hey, Mikey," she greeted politely. Her eyes then switched over to the doll in his arms, and her expression turned to shock and surprise. She was surprised to see it, and shocked to see the many cuts on his body, legs, mane, and tail. Carefully, she reached out for her, only for Mikey to suddenly pull back. April looked at Mikey confused and slightly worried. "What's wrong, Mikey?" she asked, less kindly. Mikey felt concerned and worried. His view switched towards the doll, and its expression, and his face turned to one expression of worry. April watched in silence, confused and worried, as she opened the bag of sewing supplies. After a moment, Mikey turned back to April, and he had a soft look on his face. "She's scared of the needles. Please be careful." His words were coated with softness, and still held some stitches of firm. April could hear the tiny firmness in her voice and understood why he's acting this way. Mikey carefully handed the pony to April. The teenage girl gently held it in her arms. She could sense Mikey's worried look on his face. She gave him a little smile. "Don't worry, Mikey. I'll be careful," she said gently. She turned away and walked towards the couch so she could begin her work. The young turtle watched her go as his eyes switched over to the doll. He could almost see the eyes grow slightly dim and dimmer from the sudden embrace of another that wasn't him. He followed April over to the couch and sat down on a far but close distance so April couldn't focus and not look at him. He watched her set the doll on her lap before reaching for her bag and grabbed it. She opened it wider and reached into it. She pulled out a spool of light raspberry pink thread, along with another spool of hot pink thread. And when April pulled out the needles, Mikey watched her sister impulsively. When Leo Donnie had stepped out of his lap to see April. The purple-masked turtle watched the small scene from the foot of his doors. His reddish-brown eyes saw April, and his heart suddenly began to ache. Seeing the teenage human girl made a flashback appear in his mind, but it was quickly scraped away when he saw Mikey's cautious and suspicious watch on April. The bow-staff-wielding turtle could sense his younger brother's worry from a mile away. Before he could say anything, his eyes switched over back to April and saw why he was suspicious. April was holding a needle with thread in it with one hand and the pony's doll's left foreleg with another, as she was carefully sticking the needle through and below sticking the needle through and below one of the cuts, then pulled the needle out carefully, pulling the thread out along with it, causing the cut to slowly close up a bit. Donnie walked over to Mikey and placed his hand on his shoulder and gave him a comforting smile. He saw the worry in his brother's eyes, and his eyes were filled with comfort. April knows what she's doing, Mikey. Just give her a chance. His words of comfort were enough to calm Mikey down a bit, but not enough. Donnie know it'll take a long time for Mikey to bounce back into his usual self, and he hopes it doesn't take a year or trouble will be ahead of them. Cut after cut, stitch after stitch, April remained focused on fixing the pony doll for Mikey. She wasn't going to allow any distraction come in her way and mess up her progress of stitching one of the cuts. She looked at the very last cut on the pony. This one is the biggest cut she had ever seen on the body, where the chest is supposed to be. And she could have thought she saw a small red heart plush inside, with a strangely hot pink rose barrette inside. Curiosity got the better of her, and she reached in to take it out. When her fingers touched one of the petals, she was surprised how thin and smooth it was. She carefully gripped into the barrette piece and gently pulled it out of the chest. Surprisingly, Mikey didn't overreact, which April never noticed. After cutting the thread, she looked at the newly fixed doll, and her eyes widened in realization when she took a good look at her. She smiled slightly, though it seemed fake. She didn't push it. She turned to Mikey, whose expression changed immediately when her gaze was turned towards his direction. "Mikey, where did you get this doll?" she asked, faking surprise, though it seemed to do the trick. Mikey looked at her a bit nervous. "I found her in one of the garbage cans in an alleyway," he replied. April looked at the pony doll again before turning her gaze back to Mikey. "I'm surprised you managed to find a Pinkie Pie doll." Her words caught Mikey's attention for sure when the name spilled from her mouth. "Pinkie Pie?" he repeated. April nodded and stood up. Knowing Mikey is acting cautious for some reason, she was holding the now-known Pinkie Pie doll in her arms like it was a small child. She carried it over with a gentleness in her step before she leaned down and handed the doll back to Mikey. The young turtle hugged the doll close to him with relief and joy. He smiled a bit and looked at April with a thankful expression. April got the message and nodded. Eventually, once April left the lair for the day, Mikey headed off to his room with his new freshly cleaned Pinkie Pie. The teenage girl had to help the young orange-masked turtle clean up the Pinkie Pie without messing up. He did a very good job, surprisingly. No mess up in sight. Once he was in his room, Mikey sat on his bed and placed the pony on his pillows. He looked at her for a good long moment, and he smiled. A true smile. "Pinkie Pie, it suits you," he confirmed. He gently petted the curly, bouncy mane as he stared into her eyes. Those blue, cerulean eyes were one of the things Mikey already loves most. He lays down on his bed and pulls Pinkie Pie close to his plastron, then, smiling softly, he slowly closed his eyes when he stared at her for a long moment. As he dozed off into dreamland, he could have sworn he heard a voice. A high, yet soft and weak voice, as mine, whispering tiredly.
"Thank you."